What's up everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Happy New Year. And today we're going to be talking about something very important which my brother is very good at, cornering fighters. There's lots to cover. We're going to try and touch on a number of things, not just what you're doing when you're in the corner, but other aspects. And you might be a cornerman in the future, or you can take this video and send it to your cornerman because this can make a world of difference in your fight and getting that victory. So let's first just talk about Aaron's history, my history as cornerman. I mean, I started cornering for you when you were fighting, and then you took over for me pretty much full time at the end of my amateur career. I think that's correct.
Yeah.
Up to that, we didn't really have any massive experience except for you being the second in my corner, right?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I mean, yeah, I think being the second in your corner and then just kind of over time, yeah, I just remember you kind of saying that you were getting a little bit more advice out of some of the pieces that I was offering. And I think one of the things that I've really noticed in a lot of coaches is sometimes they'll be a good cheerleader, but not necessarily a good coach. And I think that's kind of a really important distinction to make between just kind of being that coach who just kind of yells, go, 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 versus actually kind of giving the person a concrete advice that they can kind of put into a fight. And I think that's kind of what, you noticed, and the kind of when that started happening, then I started coaching you a little bit more.
Yeah, so that was a transition between the coach I used to have and I was going, I'm not getting any massive information. And then Aaron was the second, giving me things that would actually work. And like he said, like cheerleader is a good sort of example, because you get the guys and you hear them constantly like, oh, you're doing well, or you're not, or this or that, but not constructive criticism. And even when we watch UFC, I could see you sometimes kind of roll your eyes and you're like, what was that?
Well, I mean, it happens at the top level. I was just talking about a moment ago, and just thinking back to one of your glory fights against Isbiri.
Isbiri, yeah.
I just remember a lot. I think it's just a lot of the French guys, I think it's because they're so vocal. And you'll just kind of hear them the whole fight. They're just yelling, allez, allez, allez.
Let's go.
Just go, go, go. And I mean, it's not really advice.
That's not advice at all. So let's talk first. I almost want to go in sequence about what a cornerman can offer on the timeline of fighting. And this is going to take us kind of at the very end to what the cornerman should be doing in the fight, but we don't want to make the mistake in thinking that a cornerman only is there for the fight, because I believe that's not good cornering. So we basically start off, even if you're in a different province from me, he still starts off cornering me from afar in opponent prep.
Yeah, and I think that's such a big thing, because there are events I know where I've gone and I've coached Gabriel, but then I've also been asked to coach some other fighter. I think a good example is like Canada versus China event we went on. I was asked to coach some fighters, but I'd never worked with them before. I'd never kind of done that pre-prep, watching their opponents if I can, but more importantly, working with the fighter and having an understanding of the capabilities of the fighter, because I think that's essential to being a good coach, is to kind of knowing what your fighter can realistically pull off during a match. Yeah,
that makes such a big difference, because you can go in, and I've cornered for a couple guys too, where I'm going, okay, I'm going to tell you what to do, but then they can't execute in that regard because I don't know what the heck they're doing. So number one, you have to understand your fighter. Number two, not just me putting in the time to research the opponent, but your cornerman, because then the cornerman has a realistic idea of what advice they can give leading up to the fight, but then also the night of the fight. Because there's no point in you telling me to do this and this and this, but if we would have just done even a half hour of research, we would have known that's not possible with my skills and his skills. So if you have a cornerman, it's okay to ask them, watch a little bit of footage of my opponent, even when you're afar and you're in med school. He still makes time to watch the opponent, and does it need to be, every week for hours and hours? Probably not. You just get an understanding, you set over a basic game plan, and then there's more chance. Now, did you have something else you want to say on that, or?
No, I just think to elaborate on that, for your most recent fight would be a good example. Just because the guy did have 3 recent fights. And that was helpful, just because recent fights are going to be the most realistic depiction of how a guy is fighting. But if the person has 20 fights, you don't need to go back and watch all 20 fights. Maybe, yeah, if you only have the time to go in, watch 3 or 5 fights that are recent, preferably, and then you're going to be able to come up with some things that you think that are going to work offensively and things that they're going to need to watch out for defensively.
Yeah, that is what I've told you guys on the channel very often. Look for their weakness, look for their strengths, and usually within that you can find offensively and defensively their strengths, their weaknesses, and then you start dissecting them down. That's all very important to do. The Cornerman as well, moving on from that timeline where maybe, 2 months away from the fight, we're dealing with that on a fairly small scale time-wise, but then we start getting into fight week, and that's the next point where I kind of have some sort of reliance on you, where I'm going, okay, I need you there for some aspect. I've done a couple fights before where you weren't able to make it or you had to come fairly late, but still during that fight week it is nice to have somebody there for support. Not so much for me, because I'm fairly confident, but I think a cornerman should offer support mentally during fight week, because some people have a little bit of a breakdown, or it's very possible to start doubting yourself or start needing just that verbal support from the cornerman. Like I said, I don't normally need that from you, but I could see a lot of people wanting that.
Oh, absolutely.
So if you guys are out there and you're going, fight week is really stressful and I'm not getting the support I need from my cornerman during fight week, you can verbalize that to them and just say, it's something that I require, just give me that boost up, give me that extra little lift, that cheerleader lift, if you will, just to make sure that you have somebody who's like, yeah, you're ready for this. You're going to win this fight. You're going to be able to get the victory. It's just something that can be offered outside, again, of that actual fight experience.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like going back to kind of understanding your fighter, even during that fight week, you're going to get some fighters who want that person who's pumping them up a little bit more, being that cheerleader. Some fighters just kind of go about their day, just normally they walk around, they socialize. Other ones need a little time on their own. So I think it's kind of coming back to realizing not every fighter's the same. Realize that, and then, kind of act appropriately as a coach to help them.
Absolutely. Now, from there, moving on to the next timeline, to me, the next big spot where I need you is for the warm-up. Because that's the point now. With a bad warm-up, you're not going to go into the fight as good as you could possibly be. And hopefully you've established a rapport with your cornermen. If you're using them for the first time, you have to actually verbalize to them what you want in the warm-up. Because I've seen some guys go through what looks like ridiculous warm-ups, like full blast 3-3-minute rounds of hard pads, and then they're done. Whereas we start off slow, we ease in, and during this whole process, which I sort of laid out throughout the years, you're reminding me of everything that you want done.
Yeah.
You're reminding me of the weaknesses of my opponent, my strengths. You're reminding me of the composure that you want out of me.
Yeah.
And just keeping me level-headed, that's what I want. Some people need rage and anger, and they thrive off that, but you make that adjustment.
And I think kind of moving forward, once we get to the fight itself, one of the kind of key components I was going to bring up is not overloading the opponent. So I think that kind of during that warm-up time is the time where you can be discussing more aspects. If you kind of have these various offensive things and various defensive things, you can be a little bit more elaborate, whereas once you get into the ring, that might change a little bit. Yeah,
you got to tone it down. For the last one we went through during the warm-up, we were talking about all the things offensive that I wanted to do. You were drilling me on the defense. We even added in all the ground and pound stuff, which I didn't work the whole camp, but we practiced it just because we should probably do a little bit before the fight. So we you were like, if you can throw them, here's some extra things that we can add in. So during that time, you can kind of summarize everything you did in camp in that hour warm-up. And that's something the cornermen again should be doing. I've seen cornermen just sit down and watch their fighter warm up and say 0. And I'm going, geez, that's a missed opportunity.
But at the same time, if you're kind of doing some new things, trying out those various drills you've done, I wouldn't suggest throwing some brand new wrench into the mix where you're just like, realistically, they're not going to be able to pull that off. Not telling them like, we should start practicing a flying tornado kick or something like that.
Yeah.
That's just not in the scope of your fighter.
No, you just stick within everything. The only difference for me was I practiced a lot of throws for my last fight, like Muay Thai style throws. And then once I threw you down, you're like, oh, we might as well do a couple neon belly moves just because. And I hadn't trained it simply because I wasn't expecting the fight to go there. But it's still like, oh, just in case.
Yeah.
So now from here, this is the sort of, what would the expression be? I want to say meat and bones, but that's not right.
Meat and potatoes.
Meat and potatoes, thank you. The meat and potatoes of the episode, because this is where we want to talk about what does the Cornerman bring in the aspect of actual fight. And the reason I'm filming this whole thing is somebody actually put a comment in the YouTube section the other day of a different video saying, this is what I'd love to see. I'd love to see you talk about cornering and what you want out of your Cornerman, because I don't think I'm getting exactly what's needed at the moment. And if you have that question, it's okay sometimes to go, ooh, might be time to find somebody new, or to have that talk and let people know what exactly you want, or to send them this episode and let them know, you know, these guys are sort of on point with what I need and just watch this. So let's basically go by all the stuff, you know, leading up to the fight. It's kind of the same thing. Like, you know, I'm walking out, I have that last final talk with you. You remind me what's needed and what you want to see out of me. But let's jump to the end. No, let's actually jump to mid-fight.
Okay.
So we're in between rounds. You have to understand if your fighter even has the ability to process information. Like if you sit there and you yell instructions at them, there's a good chance for many new fighters, they don't take in anything. Like they don't even legitimately hear you. But if you are able to relay something to me, what do you usually do? Do you usually wait for eye contact? Like in the last fight, a couple of times you got my attention. And once I saw you, you relayed information. Do you think yelling stuff when your opponent can hear it is worth doing, or?
I think it depends on the tempo of the fight. I mean, it's also much easier when I'm coaching you, just because you are able to process that information both between rounds and during the fight. I don't think that there's anything wrong with giving the person advice that the opponent can hear, because yeah, at the same time, the opponent might not have the ability to kind of counter what you've told them to do.
Yeah.
They'd have to be a very good fighter to hear, okay, the person might do this, therefore I'm going to counter it in that way. And maybe just luckily with you, but I've never had an instance where I've given certain advice and it's backfired in any way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, generally, I'll just say for me, when I hear a cornerman from my opponent yell out something, I'm like, well, it's not going to land now. Like you just told me what you want him to do. But it's still very rarely, even for me with the thought process and the processing that I have, I very rarely come up with a counter for exactly what they want, because I'm still trying to think about my own game plan. Yeah. I just know that if they're like, throw Tyson, like Tyson, I had one guy yelling that. I'm like, well, obviously it's a punch. Tyson can't be a kick. We know that's unless they have some like cheat code thing. So
yeah, and thinking back to that last fight, I guess in terms of yelling out loud where the opponent can hear, I think that there were a couple circumstances where you were looking at me, and I think there was one high kick that you landed where I might have just kind of more mouthed or kind of mimed a head kick, and then it did land. Whereas if I'd screamed it out and the opponent had kind of heard head kick, then there's probably a lot less chance that you would have been successful with that technique. Yeah,
so I would say basically for your cornerman, if you're looking to relay information midway through the fight, don't call out specific techniques like you think it's going to land, like low kick. Like obviously everybody hears that. You want to give more vague information, I would say, things that are going to help them, but not specific techniques. That's what I find works best. And then if you do need something in particular and you can get their attention, he yells at me, Gabe, and then I look over, not obviously in the exchange, but he calls in the break moments. If he gets my attention, then he can show me something quickly, like I want that body shot, and he can do it in a somewhat subtle way. So now we move on in between rounds, and this is the really important part, which you already touched on briefly, but we'll do it again. We're in between rounds. The big thing, the big mistake that I would say most people make is, number one, just telling them you're doing great or you need to fix. You know, you didn't win that round. You're doing great, you didn't fix it. Those are both very vague, good or bad. So we need a lot more information than that. Or you can get the guys who You need to jab more. You need to slip the jab when he throws. You need to do this. You need to do that. You need to do that. So you've dialed in something that works very well. So just basically tell them sort of your strategy, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like you started to talk about. It's kind of finding the balance between the two of them. You can't be so vague that you're just saying, be more aggressive. I don't know. Yeah, but on the other end, I'm probably not going to be telling like, I want you to throw a jab, cross, slip, cross, uppercut, or something like that. So what I typically try to do when I'm watching the first round or the second round is I'm analyzing the fight as a whole, but I'm typically trying to think, what are the two best pieces of advice that I can give Gabriel in terms of changes that he can make offensively or things that are working well offensively. And sometimes it can be something very basic. Sometimes it can just be that jab and the jab's landing and you can say like, oh, continue to throw that jab. Sometimes it might be a little bit more complicated than that in terms of just kind of an overall stylistic change, pressuring a little bit more, telling him, okay, I don't want you just moving straight forward linear. I want you to be kind of getting the person to throw at you and then attacking with those counters. But I try to keep it to not too many things. And then on the opposite side, I'll do the same thing defensively. One or two things defensively that I see that the person is either dangerous when they throw or is potentially catching your fighter, and try to give him those one or two pieces of advice. Because in my mind, in between a round, you've got 1 minute, you've got to cut, you got to get the person water. They're not going to be able to take in more than 2 to 4 pieces of advice. So I think that's worked well with a lot of fighters.
Yeah, I would say mostly. And this was actually an observation that we made in one of the fights I lost because we, over the Adam Chuck fight, the first one, which I lost, I had too many people giving me information, right? You were giving me information, Lynn and Craig, and everybody was feeding me information. And I would go back into the round with 2 or 3 things from each person. And it was just a little overwhelming. And you're trying to think, oh, this and that and that. So since that fight.
And not only overwhelming, but not cohesive either. Yeah. And that's something that we learned from that fight was sometimes I'll be coaching Gabriel and it's just myself. And then sometimes I'll be coaching where there are 3 of us in the corner. And I think after that fight, you probably fought for the title again. There was at least 2 or 3 of us in the corner. And we just made sure that the cornermen are also interacting between rounds to kind of come to consensus in terms of giving advice that's cohesive, and you don't have one person say pressure forward, one other person saying be defensive and counter. So if you're cornering as a team, you got to kind of have a united front.
Yeah, and that's something that I've noticed in the UFC very often. Even with the highest level people, one cornerman will come up and he's the main dude and he'll be like, okay, go. He'll give 20 seconds of information. Then he'll look at his second and he'll go, okay, do you have something you want to say? And then that guy comes in and hopefully the second guy recognizes what the first guy said and is not clashing anything. But in my opinion, and what we've dialed in now is everybody feeds the information to Aaron and then Aaron feeds it to me. Yeah. And then we have one person doing it. And if he goes, you know what? I don't think that information is going to vibe with my information, which he's the main dude, then he can disregard it and doesn't have to worry about that. So if you have multiple people, making sure that they're all united together, they're not battling one another. And between everybody in my corner, there are different stylistic differences. They're not all on the same page. They all know my style very well, but they might ask for different things. So it's important to really sort that out. And I'm trying to think, is there anything else in particular that we should touch on? Obviously, if you're the cornerman, cuts can arise. I've been cut a lot, and you were just kind of put on the spot the first time I got cut. They were going to stop the fight, and the person, whoever the doctor was not doing a good job. It was my first pro fight. I walked out, I think 7 seconds, I got like kicked in the head, something like 7 stitches there, and it wasn't like you had any experience.
No, I mean, I think I'd really just had a crash tutorial before we came on that event. We have a friend in the family who is a doctor. I think that we were able to get some epinephrine. Is that what it is?
It's like liquid adrenaline, essentially?
Liquid adrenaline, epinephrine, essentially causes your blood vessels to constrict. And they use that a lot of times in the fight. So I think he pretty much told me, here's your epinephrine Q-tips. They're dipped in epinephrine. They're ready to go. pretty much once you put it in the cut, it's going to cause that to kind of dissolve and spread. So pretty much what I'd been told was put the Q-tip in the cut, squeeze the cut really, really tight. So yeah, I just pretty much did what I've been told, where I put it in, decent amount of pressure, squeezed it nice and tight, try to stop that blood flow, and then filled it up with as much Vaseline as possible. And the few times that I have, I've been lucky enough that we typically have Alain, who's a great cutman, or a lot of the top organizations will provide cutmen. So I'm happy to sit back because they know a lot more than I do.
Yeah.
But if you're in that situation, you're at a more of like a regional, local event, you've got to handle a cut, then that would be the key advice. Even if you don't have the epinephrine, essentially get it in there, lots of pressure, hold it for maybe the 30 seconds, fill it up with Vaseline, and hopefully that'll stop the bleed.
Yeah. And now, just because we're kind of doing this episode on the fly, we're not going to be able to come up with a perfect list here, but let's just sort of talk priority when they come back. So if the person comes back and they're winning the round, and you're like, oh, you're doing well, there's not too much information to give, you're crushing it, watch for this, watch for that. It's not even a minute. Remember, people say minute break, but your fighter has to get back, and then there's the 10 seconds, so it's probably realistically more like 45 at best.
Yeah, definitely.
You've got to get them water. But keep in mind, you don't want to give them water too quickly, because they might come back and you're like, here, drink the water, and they start choking. So you've got to get them back. First thing, calm them down.
Yeah, typically I don't start spouting off advice as soon as the person hits the stool.
Yeah.
Even with Gabriel, whose cardio is incredible, he'll kind of sit down, we'll take a few seconds, we'll get him some water if he needs some water, and then I'll start giving my advice. And kind of by then, kind of in my head, I've composed those 2 to 4 things that I want to pass on.
And I feel like a lot of times when he comes back, if I need to give him information, he's listening and probably analyzing what I look like when I come back too. If it's an easy fight and I'm winning, well, there's not too much, he already knows that. But if it's a harder fight, you probably make a quick assessment, like, okay, how's he looking? What's happening? So that's your first few seconds in the corner. And then once their heart rate slowed down, you can tell they're not going to choke on their water. Yeah, you get them some water. You can make the assessment, do they need the cold steel? Because that's a priority. If they're cut or bruised, you got to get to that right away. But then on top of that, you got to make sure that you are delivering information, because if they are bruised or cut, the fight's obviously not going perfect.
And if you just got those remaining 40 seconds kind of between them getting the stool back to the stool, and then you're giving them the water, and especially if it's just you in the corner, then you do need to be doing things simultaneously, especially if you're kind of thinking, okay, cold steel, it's something where you want to put that pressure on, you're going to hold it there as long as essentially possible. So I can't just be focusing on a cut, focusing on the steel, and not giving advice. So you are going to need to be able, if it's kind of a one-man team, be able to do those things simultaneously.
And you guys might be going, this is the last thing I'll say for today's episode, because we've gone a decent amount of time. You might be going, how do I prep up for that? Like, Aaron, you just kind of learned on the fly, right? But if I was talking to you guys today and I was saying, you're a cornerman, or you're a team, like we used to have 5 or 6 other guys who would train with us, and we're all a team helping each other for fights and such. So if you have that situation, you're like, I want to be the best cornerman I can. I want to test out myself in this situation. Basically go in for a sparring session, have 2 guys sparring, have 2 cornermen, have a ref in the middle, and basically go, okay, when they come back, somebody says like, okay, he has a bruise under his left eye. You get your cold steel, you practice delivering information. You can prep for all these things aside from doing it the way that we did it, where it's just kind of like, Aaron, go. You're on the spot. You got to remember this and this and this and this. And it's going to all be prepped up for the same way anything can. If you're nervous about fighting, there are ways, which I'll get to in a future episode, to teach you how to be less stressed. There's no magic secret to less stress, but there are ways that you can practice for that stress to make it more familiar. So if you want to be a better cornerman, don't be like, oh, I'm going to wait until the next fight and I'll just be a better cornerman. You can actually go and practice just in the gym and just create stressful situations like, okay, he's cut. I got to do this and I got to deliver the information. I got to get him his water. I got to not be stressed out. I got to stay calm so my fighter stays calm. These are perfect ways to practice.
And that's great advice too, just in terms of maybe putting your fighters in a slightly higher stress situation where you're like, oh, you're going to simulate a fight. And then you're also going to kind of be able to come back to see, what is my fighter able to pull off? So it's going to come full circle to what we were talking about earlier on.
Yeah. Yeah. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us today. And this is all important stuff. I know this is not for everybody on the channel. Every person cares about this, but the people who do care, I know you really care. And that's what I want to do on this channel, as you guys know, deliver information which other people are not giving you, but is very wanted. So if you enjoyed the episode, please give it a like. If you haven't already, join the channel and get subscribed. As always, train hard. I'll see you back here soon for another episode.